Welcome to the Inside Politics podcast. I'm Hugh Linehan. Vincent Browne, in your article for the Irish Times at the weekend, you're arguing that Gerry Adams perhaps doesn't get due or fair recognition for his role. I think you argue his absolutely crucial and central role in the peace process, either in the South or from the Unionist community in the North. Why do you think that is?
I suppose because of horror at the atrocities perpetrated by the IRA over so many decades would be the main thing. But also, and the part of the unionist community, also for another factor, which I think is interesting in the context of the present difficulties in Northern Ireland. And it is the failure of the unionist community in the North to realise that the Good Friday Agreement was a triumph for unionism. And I say that because the difference between nationalists and unionists, or the ideological difference between nationalism and unionism, was that unionists insisted that only the people of Northern Ireland had the right to determine the constitutional future of Northern Ireland. Nationalists insisted that, no, it was the people of Ireland that had the right to determine that. And the Good Friday Agreement involved all of nationalist and Republican Ireland accepting that the unionist proposition that only the people of Northern Ireland would determine the future of Northern Ireland. And it's extraordinary that the unionist community didn't appreciate that. And the reason I think they didn't was because Adams was able to spin a defeat as a triumph to his own side, and so effective was it that the other side believed it as well.
So you actually had this, people have mentioned this kind of paradox where nationalists don't realise they've lost and unionists don't realise they've won.
Yes. Now, there are other factors at play, of course, namely the defeat or the destruction of the Orange State. And that was a crucial part of the outcome of the Good Friday Agreement and of what had gone on over 20 or 30 years before that. And that was a huge issue. And that is the issue now that's at stake in the current difficulties at Stormont, that the remnants of the Orange State are still around and still ingrained in the DUP mindset and still causing problems.
I was just looking at a news story in the Irish Times this morning. It was about Alex Maskey on Twitter responding to a comment about Northern Ireland, and he described Northern Ireland as a squalid little statelet which caused, kerfuffles among the DUP, and it was a typical kind of a, miniature in microcosm picture of the problems which are the recurring problems which are still there. But one of the things that occurred to me about that was that Alex Maskey was responding to a tweet by the SDLP leader, Colm Eastwood. And Colm Eastwood had been was talking about the centenary of the women's vote, and he was talking about political reform in Northern Ireland. And Alex Maskey was arguing, as is the Sinn Féin position, that political reform, that the civil rights movement would not have been sufficient to deliver the political reform that was necessary in Northern Ireland. And doesn't this go back to the crux of what Seamus Mallon was saying for years, that you describe in your article in the Irish Times on Saturday, people being burned alive in Le Mans, families being slaughtered at Enniskillen, and this was all to address the problems of gerrymandering in local politics and lack of fair access to council housing. Could that not have been addressed by other means?
Well, I think that one of the intriguing things about Northern Ireland for me is what was it that tipped people over from one day being effectively pacifists or uninvolved, and then within a very short period of time being willing to kill people. And that's a crucial transition, I think. And I think that the reason for that, I could be quite wrong about this, but I think the reason for that was a build-up of anger and frustration and resentment arising from the humiliation that the Orange State inflicted on nationalists. But in addition to that, and Seamus Mallon makes this point too, allied to that humiliation was a sense of abandonment by the British, on the part of the British state, the Westminster, but also and crucially by the Southern state. Southern state was not remotely interested over all the years from 22 up to 68, in fact beyond 68, 69, not remotely interested in the issues of discrimination, gerrymandering, etc. in Northern Ireland, and were oblivious to the mounting anger of the nationalist community. When the conflict started, Gerry Adams was in the Republican movement, which was then still united, and he was very much part of what became, his ethos was very much part of what became the official Republican movement. When the split came in late December of '69, and in the case of Sinn Féin in January of '70, he dithered for quite a while. He didn't go with the Provost for several months, and I suspect it was because he was uneasy with the politics of the Provost.
Which part of their politics do you suspect he was uneasy with?
The physical force stuff.
The physical force stuff, right, yeah.
And there was an incident which I think is significant. He was very much a Ballymurphy man, and there were riots in Ballymurphy in April of 1970, which caused trouble down here too. It led to movement of arms to Dundalk by the army. But Adams was very much the British Army forced an Orange March through part of Ballymurphy, and which had never happened before. The Orange March had never been there before, and there was rioting went on for several days. And Billy McKee, who was the OC of the Provost in Belfast at the time, sent 3 gunmen up to sort out the British Army, and Adams asked them not to engage in gunfire, and he said we're able to handle it. And the riot was very well stewarded and organised, and he was against the use of gunfire at that time, which I think is an interesting insight into what he was about. Now, later on, he became OC in Belfast, and during that time, terrible atrocities were perpetrated. Jean McConville, I think the bombing of London started, and there were other awful things happened. But his instinct, the idea that the old-style Republican bloodlust was instilled in him, I think is not true.
So you're suggesting that you can trace a line in Adams's political thinking right from the early days through the 1980s and his assumption of the Sinn Féin leadership and the move to a democratic strategy, right from the very start?
None of us are that consistent or that coherent. And I spoke to Adams about, after reading Ed Maloney's book, Inside History of the IRA, or The Secret History of the IRA. And Ed Maloney's book almost makes a hero out of Adams, or a Superman out of Adams, in that he was so far-seeing, he saw the whole thing panning out in the way it did right from the beginning. And of course, nobody is capable of doing that. And in the case of Adams, my perception is that his mind changed as things went on, and he had different perceptions, different ideas, could see how things were going in a different way. And that's true of us all anyway. Another feature I think is worth, here in the Irish Times, worth reflecting on, and it is the role of the media. That had the media bothered itself with highlighting what was going on in Northern Ireland, say just even during the 60s, of how the Con McCluskey, the GP in Dungannon, starting up a civil rights, I forgot what it was called at the time, but starting up a civil rights movement of some kind of that. Had the media latched into that and then got involved in reporting on what was going on in Northern Ireland, things might have been a bit different, but the media just played dead. Instead, the Irish Times sent a senior person up to Stormont, I think it was Fergus Pyle, later editor, to report on Stormont, what was going on in Stormont, missing the point completely about what was going on the ground. Of course, that happens in journalism all the time.
Indeed, the Irish Times at fault again there, Sarah, but there's...
The Irish Times is to blame.
Indeed, always.
Yes, it's a pity that our political culture doesn't express an abhorrence with violence of any kind. But this has been going on since the start of the state. Our state was born in violence, and the early part of the state was a period of of appalling violence, appalling atrocities. The War of Independence wasn't a clean war. There were terrible atrocities perpetrated. There's informers murdered all over, alleged informers murdered all over the place. That's the way with war, and it's good reason why nobody should engage in war of any kind. But we got over that, and it's hardly surprising that the people involved in the conflict in Northern Ireland wouldn't have the same. And by the way, nobody apologised. Nobody on either side of the Civil War apologised for what went on until many, many years later. And it's hardly surprising that there's a similar obduracy on both sides of Northern Ireland now, and particularly on the Sinn Féin or Republican side. But can I make a point about politics? I take a completely different view of that to you. I'm deeply disappointed with Sinn Féin's political evolution. Gerry Adams was one of the people who inspired a radical break with the conservatism of the first era NUA policy document of the early 70s, devised by Rory O'Brien and Dave O'Connell. And he came out with a revolutionary socialist agenda in a new version of Era NUA in 1979, promising changing the structures of Irish society very radically and to make it much more equal and democratic society. That's all gone. Sinn Féin now has, bit by bit, slid in or is sliding into the establishment politics of the South, which means that anybody who votes for Sinn Féin in the next election and expecting change will be gravely disappointed. It will be the same old stuff. The same as you may as well vote for Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or the Labour Party because you get the same as Sinn Féin.
So do you think he ever believed in the revolutionary socialism which he espoused in the late 70s?
I do, but so did a lot of people who were stickies, who were left-wing in the Irish Times. And look what they turned out to be. Members of the Progressive Democrats later on. That's the way it goes.
I think that happens to everybody except you, Vincent, isn't it? You travelled in the other direction. You went from Fine Gael to the other direction.
I look out there in the newsroom and there's full of them.
They're all retired now, Vincent.
Not enough of them are retired.
But I just wonder, was that, were some of those trappings of, being in favour of nationalising everything and controlling the means of credit and all that kind of stuff. It's all very easy to say when you're meeting and, with your party members, with your Aaron Ganzis and your berets on. It's another matter when you're actually running for election.
There you go. You see, you were them.
I always was.
Isn't it a pity we didn't have control of financial institutions? We wouldn't have gone in. We probably wouldn't have gone into the crisis we did in the last one. And by the way, Sinn Féin or the lefties were the only parties in favour of that. I was a member of Fine Gael in the 60s, and Fine Gael was in favour of that. Declan Costa's Justice Society talked about controlling financial institutions, controlling the banks, not quite nationalising them, though there was a hint of nationalisation. So had we gone a more radical road, look at the kind of awful society we live in now. We have masses of people living in misery. Loads of people who don't have houses, loads of people, children living in poverty. And it's a sort of what the hell, what do you expect? And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is.
But if one were to accept that point for a moment, isn't then what Gerry Adams has presided over the worst kind of scam or fraud on the people who tend to vote for Sinn Féin, who tend to be people who suffer most at the hands of the system, which you're describing there, and they're basically being defrauded by a party that claims to be representing their interest in the way that you suggest they like it, but they're not doing it.
You talk about fraud. I would argue that actually fraud is far too strong a word. But the idea of Irish freedom was an illusion. That, yes, we got rid of the personages in power or in office in this society by gaining independence. But we put in a load of clonkos fellows to take over from them, and they were no different. They brought the same ideology, the same priorities to bear as the old British aristocracy or the old British establishment did. And nothing is fundamentally changed. In many ways, we'd been better off to have stayed within the UK because the welfare state was getting up and running at that time. I'm just making the point that it isn't only Sinn Féin has perpetrated, as you call it, fraud. That's the nature of opportunist politics, and that's characterised the politics of this state since the beginning.
Sarah, I want to ask you about about Vincent's point, because it strikes me, looking at modern Sinn Féin and its parliamentary party, that talking to people like, I don't know, Louise O'Reilly, say, or Eoin O'Brien, they seem to represent a fairly coherent ideological, left of centre position in the Irish span. Vincent might disagree, and I'll give him the chance to do so in a minute if he wants. But that they do form part of a party which seems to be a larger coalition, that certain rural deputies don't necessarily seem to kind of be signed up to that in the same way. As he departs the stage, we know there have been all these problems, interpersonal problems with councillors, and they've been going on right up to this week. But what about ideological splits or different visions of what Sinn Féin is as a party and should be in the future? Are they going to emerge?
I think so. I think if you look, and obviously I don't want to keep bringing it back to the issue of abortion, but if you do look at that particular issue, you have people like Louise O'Reilly and Mary Lou McDonald and Eoin O'Brien who would argue very much for the party to support the Oireachtas Committee recommendations to allow for abortions up to 12 weeks and repeal the Eighth Amendment. That wouldn't necessarily be in line with the Sinn Féin grassroots. In fact, what they passed at their Ardèche in November was difficult enough for them to pass, which was abortions in certain circumstances. And now they have a battle on their hands to get the party behind them when they alter their position again in advance of the referendum. So though that's just one particular issue, but there is an ideological split between the party. But I think what you will see over the next number of years is, yes, okay, Gerry Adams leaves the stage, and with him he takes a great deal of experience. But I think what you will see is there will be a changing of the guard over the next 5 years. So those who have worked very closely with Gerry Adams, for example, people like Ken O'Connell, who would be the political director in the South, would be removed over time. He will be replaced by Mary Lou McDonald's own staff, and I think you'll see the party change its dynamic quite quickly. But one thing they've already done is they've already changed their party policy with regards to coalition. They always said they would only enter coalition in the South as the largest party. They changed that position in November. They're now willing to enter coalition as a junior party. They've changed their policies. If you look at their pre-budget submission, they've dropped their infamous wealth tax proposals. They're trying to make themselves... Which is exactly the kind of thing that Vincent's criticising them for. Yeah, now, to be fair, I mean, you can criticise them for it, you can applaud them for it, but the reality is they're doing it. It's because, from my perspective, Sinn Féin has one goal, which is to be in power, and it's willing to do anything, change its policies, change its stance on coalition just to get into office. Hasn't there always been an element with Sinn Féin that's always the case, Vincent? That its primary objective, above all else, which is not true of some of the other smaller left-wing parties in Ireland, it seems to me, its primary objective is to get into power, both north and south. Yes, everything else is secondary.
Same as Fianna Fáil, same as Fine Gael, same as the Labour Party. And that's my criticism of them. They've become the same as the establishment parties. And that's difficult. If I could just add, it's just... Sinn Féin has marketed themselves, obviously, as being different to the establishment parties. So whilst you can say, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and Labour Party will alter their party policies to get into power, Sinn Féin has marketed themselves as a party against the establishment. So the mere fact that they're willing to go down the same road as the so-called establishment parties spells more trouble for them. Well,
I think that's...
Labour Party has always marketed itself as anti-establishment too. But can I just go back...
Lots of people market themselves as anti-establishment. Yeah. Donald Trump is anti-establishment.
Everybody does. It's not into this stage.
Except the Irish Times.
Not all parts of the Irish
I'm amused by a reference to hardline Catholics, of whom I'm sure there are none in the Irish Times. But there is a problem on issues such as abortion for Sinn Féin. And it arises from the fact that Catholics in Northern Ireland are far more conservative than Catholics in the South. And the reason for that, I suspect, is because that's part of their identity vis-a-vis the Protestant Northern Ireland. And therefore they're more hardline than Catholics in the South. And that's why they're far more cautious on the issue of abortion, for instance, and I'm sure they were cautious on the issue of divorce too previously. So there is a difficulty there for them and will persist, especially as, given what is now likely to happen if the abortion referendum goes through, that abortion is going to be a major issue in Irish politics for the next 50 years, and I'm not looking forward to another 50 years of that.
None of us are.
I agree. I want to ask you one last question, because to go back to where we started at the start, if Gerry Adams is due credit for ending the violence on this island, and I can take some responsibility and credit for that, does he not also need to take responsibility for the grim sectarian stalemate which exists now in Northern Ireland in terms of the political process there, the kind of the institutional two-sidesism that applies to everything, the kind of the sclerotic nature of the Good Friday, institutions. Does he not need to take responsibility for that as well? It's a long way from the much vaunted Republican ideal of Catholic Protestant and dissenter.
Well, I think it's a bit rough to lay that at the door of Adams. Though, of course, the fact that he and his organisation were involved in the murder of so many unionists over the years, including unionist politicians, that has left a legacy, and an understandable and justifiable legacy of antagonism towards and has divided Northern Ireland. But Northern Ireland was divided anyway. And Northern Ireland was a deeply sectarian society and became more sectarian and more divided during the years from 1922 up to 1969 when the conflict broke out. And then got worse, of course, because of the conflict itself. And the undoing of that is not within the powers of any individual. And it will take, I don't know, 50, 100 years, or maybe longer.
But there's some argument. Myself and Colin were talking just before we come in here, and there are a number of conflicts around the world at the moment, perhaps because of the way that geopolitics works now. Colin mentioned the Balkans. If you look at somewhere like Bosnia, and there are certain other frozen conflicts that seem, because a treaty or a peace treaty of some sort was imposed, but the underlying conflict wasn't resolved, that it seems as if certain parts of the world are just stuck in a way that they can't get out of it, and that in a way the peace agreement itself sort of institutionalizes national divisions or sectarian divisions, and that kind of looks like the way it is.
Yes, that is a problem with the Good Friday Agreement, that it has institutionalized the sectarian divide. But what else? What were the alternatives? And the idea that if you had what's called normal politics, you'd have a prominent unionist majority in Stormont and in the executive, and that was a so special arrangement that had been made. This is a huge difficulty, no doubt. My wife was born in Myanmar, in Burma, and we went back there at the beginning of last year. And one thing that I found very striking was that everybody that we talked to about the Rohingya issue, everybody, without exception, everybody was massively hostile to the Rohingyas. And there was sectarianism that was at least as virulent as the sectarianism in Northern Ireland. And I suspect that's true all over the world, and in places where there's been similar conflicts. And it's part of us as human beings.
We'll leave it there. Vincent, thanks very much for coming in.